Congress returns to D.C. today, yet again facing a tight deadline to avoid a government shutdown later this week. House Speaker Mike Johnson now has a plan in place, but it's already meeting with opposition from both sides. NTD's Melina Wisecup has more.
House Speaker Mike Johnson over the weekend unveiled a two-part plan, a so-called laddered approach to temporarily extend government funding to avoid a shutdown later this week. This is an uncommon approach, and it addresses government funding in two parts. The first part would expire mid-January on January 19th, and it addresses only certain parts of the government, including military, Veterans Affairs, transportation, housing, and the Energy Department. The second part of the bill would expire just a bit later on February 2nd. And that would address the rest of the government.
To get something to the Senate, to move things along, to at least deliver something sooner rather than later.
The plan doesn't include any extra money for Ukraine, Israel, or funding for the U.S. border, but Johnson says the plan is meant to avoid Congress's holiday tradition of massive loaded-up spending bills introduced right before the Christmas recess. But this plan is not welcomed by everyone. There are at least a handful of Republicans, including the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry, who are opposing it because it doesn't include spending cuts.
I'm tired of this. Let's pass it so we can get to pass a budget. I've been dealing with that for 5 years, and it's never happened.
There's another question to this. That is, if more Democrats support it than Republicans who are opposing it, would that then open up Speaker Johnson to the same amount of scrutiny by his own caucus that former Speaker Kevin McCarthy faced not too long ago when he was ousted? And in other news, the House tonight will take a vote on a procedural motion to table Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's motion to impeach DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. We are watching to see how this procedural vote plays out in the House, because if it fails, then that would mean that the House would take an entire House vote on whether or not to officially impeach the DHS Secretary. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Wisecup, NTD News. And
now over to the 2024 election cycle. A presidential candidate is suddenly dropping out, while another one is doubling down on the campaign. NTD's Ariane Pazdar has an update on some key races.
Lowering prescription drug prices, growing the middle class, lowering costs and easing inflation.
These are some of the promises Virginia gubernatorial candidate Abigail Spanberger is making. The three-term Democratic representative also says she will fight for abortion access, calling it
and stopping extremists from shredding women's reproductive rights.
Virginia's constitution doesn't allow consecutive terms for governors. It's unclear what current governor Glenn Youngkin's political future holds after his term. On the national stage, presidential candidate Nikki Haley is spending big in Iowa and New Hampshire. Haley will spend $10 million on television, radio, and digital advertising. She hopes the money will give her an advantage over Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Now let's take a look at the polls. As of Monday, former President Trump still clearly leading the GOP primaries. He has about 56%. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis does come in second, but far behind Trump, trailing by about 40 percentage points. And Nikki Haley and tech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy are both under 10% at this time. Meanwhile, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott suddenly suspended his presidential campaign on Sunday night. Watch.
I am suspending my campaign. I think the voters who are the most remarkable people on the planet have been really clear that they're telling me not now, Tim.
The news was so surprising that one campaign staff reportedly found out Scott was dropping out by watching the show. Scott says he's not endorsing any one of the remaining candidates at this point. And stepping down after 19 years, longtime Democratic Congressman Brian Higgins of a heavily Democratic district in Buffalo, New York, is stepping down. He cited a slow pace on the Hill this year, indicating frustration over the way things are going in D.C. He plans to resign early next year. Ariane Pazdar, NTD News.
As former President Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., returns to a New York City courtroom, we'll take a look at Trump's legal cases. Where does his legal team plan to go from here? Joining us now to assess, we have senior Trump advisor Kash Patel. Kash Patel, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Steve, thanks for having me back on the program.
Of course, happy to have you, Kash. With Donald Trump Jr. testifying in the Manhattan civil case and the former president's attorney hinting at a possible mistrial filing, could you sort of explain to us what this motion might entail and your perspective on its potential outcome?
Well, Generally speaking, a mistrial is that there was such an egregious error made by either the opposing party or the judge in the case that the law requires a dismissal of the charge. That's what a mistrial is. That's what you're seeking. And in this case, as everyone knows, there's no jury. It's just the judge, the opposing party, and Donald J. Trump and his team and his family. And what I've gleaned from watching this case play out is that there are a number of reasons that a mistrial should be posited here. One, the judge's chief clerk has been caught violating the canons of ethic that govern her involvement in these proceedings. And that alone is worthy of a mistrial application. And it's now being borne out that the judge knew of those violations and kept her on this case anyway. And why is that relevant? Well, the canons of ethics are rules for lawyers in the courts of law that we have to abide by. I did when I was a prosecutor and public defender. And if this lawyer abused those rules and broke them for political advantageous reasons, then of course a case with the former president of the United States that she's helped guiding legally is one that she cannot preside over or assist in.
Kash, there's so much going on between all the different cases, the civil case, multiple criminal ones. Considering the upcoming Georgia bench trial that could potentially challenge a key aspect of Jack Smith's indictment in the role of Brad Raffensperger as a crucial witness, how do you foresee this trial influencing Smith's election-related and January 6 cases in D.C., especially with the jury questionnaire draft due on the same day?
Yeah, well, trying to figure out how these cases will fit into a puzzle together is far beyond my intellectual capacity. But what I think you're going to see, Steve, as each and every one of these cases plays out, is a historic collision of law and fact and politics. And that last portion of it, politics, is supposed to stay out of it. But the courts have become so weaponized, and the law enforcement agencies at the criminal and civil level have become so politicized that they are forcing a collision of these matters that are, generally speaking and historically speaking, in the United States of America, kept apart, except when you're adjudicating them at the polls. So I don't know how it's going to play out. It's going to complicate matters for witnesses. It's going to complicate people's Fifth Amendment privileges. It's going to complicate Donald Trump's other 3 cases and the appellate process. And oh, by the way, we have an election now, just to remind an audience, in less than 1 year.
And speaking of that election and the politics of it all, I want to get your thoughts on the campaign with Senator Tim Scott exiting the race. Do you think this will ultimately benefit Trump's campaign? And at what point, if any, should the GOP consider rallying exclusively around Trump as the frontrunner?
Well, I think they should consider that immediately. I think the polls speak for themselves, and whether you like Donald Trump or dislike Donald Trump, the math doesn't lie. And whether you believe it's 40 points or 50 points or what have you, that it's not like we're talking about 2, 3, 5, and even 10 points. And I think Senator Scott, ran a good campaign, and he listened to the people around him, and they said, hey, we're just not making the numbers, so we might as well bow out. And look, the rest of the folks in there aren't making the numbers either. It's not like Senator Tim Scott was really trailing behind. I mean, you're talking about people who are polling at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 position points on the polling process. So if the GOP, and I'm using big quote marks, actually cared about pressing forward with a Republican candidate, they would take the smart political decision that the Democrats normally do and galvanize early. Because the job of the GOP is to bring in not just Republicans, but to bring in independents and maybe moderate Democrats that say, wait a second, the country is heading in the wrong direction. And if we started that campaign now, almost a year before the election process, I think we would bring tens of thousands of voters over. And as you know, Steve, from covering elections, presidential elections used to not come down to 15, 20, 25,000 votes, but now they certainly do. And it's looking like this one may, but I believe Donald Trump has the ability to put on an Agenda 47 that he has that is so crushing, not just the Democrats, but the Republicans in the contest, that when they're asked on national TV, what policy do you have that's better than Donald Trump? And I still have yet to hear an answer from any of them on it.
Kash Patel, as always, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.